Take 574. Ecocriticism. What is it? We're going to be looking at The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd, an iconic book in nature writing circles and beyond, which deals with what can only be described as an intense romance between Nan Shepherd and her native Cairngorm landscape. For now, though, let's start by breaking down the word itself. Eco comes from the word ecology, which in turn comes from the Greek words oikos, meaning family, house, or dwelling place, and logos, meaning word, language, or the language of reason. Okay, cool. So, when we're talking about ecology, we're talking about a family of things, a system, and the earth as their dwelling place. But why not call it environmental criticism or envirocriticism? Well, environment comes from the French environ and propagates a degree of separateness between us as humans and our environ, our surroundings. This distinction may seem subtle, but it embodies one of the core messages of ecocriticism, which is to re-evaluate the relationship between the human and the non-human, challenging the idea that has embedded itself in global consciousness that Homo sapiens are top number one species with all the knowledge and all the power. Homo sapiens didn't always hold this belief. Ancient cultures thought themselves at the mercy of the gods, who carried out their whims through natural forces, so people began by trying to get to know nature in order to know how to please their gods. In the West, Greek philosophers worked out by about 6th century BC that actually, storms and droughts and winds and rain and crop yields had little to do with offerings to personal deities, and started to view the forces of nature as necessary elements in a universe created by a god. Theologians at this time began to regard the Book of Nature with almost equal respect to the Bible. Whilst this is not an actual physical book, the Book of Nature represents this idea that God is communicating through nature, and that observing the natural world would help to interpret the scripture of the Bible. By the 12th century BC, the study of nature was helping to establish relationships between groups of plants and animals which shared similar characteristics, but it became increasingly clear that there was only room for one book on the shelf. Meanwhile, in the East, Hindu attitudes towards nature differ in that religion seems to have a long-standing attitude of moral responsibility towards nature. There is not so much an attempt to rationalise it, but to protect it and worship it. For example, there is a Hindu concept called yagna, which can be translated as sacrifice. One way Hindus observe yagna is to set aside a patch of land to remain untouched instead of using it for agriculture, to promote diversity and provide a habitat for wild creatures. Modern forestry techniques adopt the same principles. For example, Forestry on Land Scotland, aka Forestry Commission, have natural reserves, which are semi-natural woodlands which are given minimum intervention to promote maximum biodiversity. Sadly, the majority of humanity seems to have adopted a colonial-style relationship to the earth, exploiting it with a mindset of externality. Externality is this idea that there's an environment somewhere out with our immediate surroundings that's available for exploitation. For example, this could look something like, Westminster being totally cool with their nuclear subs being stored up in Fastlane, or Western countries shipping their waste over to poor countries to deal with, or big oil companies drilling in the Arctic, and if an oil spill happens, at least it's not in their backyard, or how politicians don't seem to give a crap about climate change because they don't have to face the first-hand impacts in the global south. Sadly, it's an equality issue, and the worse the crisis gets, the more of the poorest people will suffer. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but pause. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but still, it's this idea that there will always be more and more and more, and if we can't make that happen, it's all good, let's just see what Mars has to offer. I legit saw an article in the newspaper a few weeks ago about scientists saying in 12 years from now it'll be possible for babies to be born in space. Eco-critics would seek to expose the idea of externality as a myth, and draw attention to the interconnectivity of all life and the finality of destruction. It feels like we're so wrapped up in human concern that things are going from Anthropocene to Anthropocene. So, how does literature come into play? Well, literary ecocriticism is just one of a big web of interconnected areas called green studies. Thinkers are also asking the same type of questions in areas such as social justice, economics, and politics. It's one of many interdisciplinary fields between science and humanities, sharing common grounds with the likes of ethnobotany, which focuses specifically on the relationship between plants and people. In Lawrence Cope's words, ecocriticism essentially is the study of a relation between literature and nature, in particular the literary representation of nature, and just as importantly, the power of literature to inspire its readers to act in defence of nature. There is no distinct methodology of reading a text. Rather, eco-critics draw on tools used in other areas of literary criticism to curate and generate questions regarding nature and culture. The hermeneutic cycle is used to explain. The hermeneutic cycle is a useful model to explain how this works. It can be argued that in the UK, eco-criticism entered the academic sphere when social theorist Raymond Williams started looking at this tendency writers had to look back in time for a sense of rural contentment in The Country and the City, published in 1973, after which Jonathan Bates started examining the work of Wordsworth in Romantic Ecology, 1991, arguing that the poet called for environmental and social responsibility through his writing. Then Terry Gifford came along and looked further at a relationship with nature, which, to quote Coop, differentiates between three modes of writing. 1. The pastoral, the received literary form. 2. The anti-pastoral, the critique of that form, particularly insofar as it distorts rural reality or justifies rural hierarchy. 3. The post-pastoral, a newly inclusive mode which, whilst treating the pastoral itself with suspicion, affirms the human need for a deep relationship with nature. Lawrence Coop created an extremely handy book called The Green Studies Reader from Romanticism to Ecocriticism, which is a great point of reference for people who want to dive deeper into this field. In the States, Lawrence Beale started looking at Thoreau's Walden in 1973, identifying the way in which Thoreau put nature at the core of his writing, he himself fading into the background. Cheryl Glotfelty was the first professor of literature and the environment, united the field by bringing together voices of experts in the Ecocriticism Reader, published in 1996. Here are some typical questions these folks might ask. How is nature represented in the text? Where is the environment placed in the power hierarchy? How do we see the issue of ecological crisis reflected in the text? What is the influence of metaphors and representations of nature on how we treat it? How are animals represented in this text, and what's their relationship to humans? Is nature empowered or oppressed? What parallels can be drawn between the suffering and oppression of minority groups and the treatment of the land? What do the rhetorical moves used by environmentalists teach us about our relationship with nature? Because eco-criticism is such a young field, there are plenty of articles out there seeking to define it exactly. It's interesting to look back and see how perspectives have changed. Peter Barry separates landscape into 4 zones to be analysed: the urban, the pastoral, the scenic sublime, and the pristine wilderness, but I would argue that these zones no longer exist. As other eco-critics point out, there is not one patch of ground unaffected by the influences of man, whether this is due to the effects of global warming, erosion, or acid rain. A quote from Nan Shepherd. Up on the plateau, nothing has moved for a long time. I have walked all day and seen no one. I have heard no living sound. Once, in a solitary quarry, the rattle of falling stone betrayed the passage of a line of stags. But up here, no movement, no voice. Man might be 1,000 years away. At first, it might seem appropriate to categorise the cairngorms in the pristine wilderness zone, but I have issues with this. Gary Snyder provides clarity on the difference between the concepts of wild and nature in his book of essays, The Practice of the Wild, and from his definition, it's hard to call the cairngorms truly wild in modern times. The most prevalent reason for this judgment is the volumes of people who are drawn there, and all the man-made infrastructure that 80 years ago consisted of bridges made from planks of wood, yet now includes a restaurant and a gondola. I'd even go so far as to say that this assumption that they are wild places would amount to a kind of cultural appropriation, whereby the wild land has been colonised and we sapiens recreate an artificial and convenient version of true wilderness we suppressed. The shifting baseline not only applies to the number of people on the hill, but the attitude towards nature changing from a phenomenon to a commodity, and from a source of reverence to something to be stewarded and protected. Shepherd acknowledges this herself in the foreword written for the book in 1977, noting there were too many boots, too much commotion, but then how much uplift for how many hearts. Torn between the erosion damage caused by such traffic and the spiritual nourishment gleaned from being in the mountain air. This quotation appears in parenthesis, a precursor to the writing style adopted by Nan Shepherd throughout the novel, where she places herself in the background and acts more like a guide to steer our attention towards nature. This is similar to Thoreau's writing style in Walden. In both works, nature is not the backdrop for our actions, but their actions are a way for them to talk about nature and explore their relationship to it. It's an important question for us to consider, though, this idea of responsibility to conserve areas, and where it interferes with our freedom. Shepherd talks about peering into a bird's nest, something she used to do out of innocent curiosity, being seen as a vagabondist action. In a society where the right to roam is such an ingrained concept, are we in need of more exclusion zones where nature is left completely undisturbed, or are we better off educating ourselves more about responsibility and employing more path builders to combat the effects of erosion? Wait a minute. So, is ecocriticism just about praising nature writing? Nope. Ecocritics do seem to bring the hype to literary works with an ecocentric perspective and praise writers who put nature on a platform, giving it a voice. However, ecocritics can read and examine any genre. Ecocriticism can work in parallel to other theories, creating fields such as ecofeminism. And good people to start research with here include Victoria Plumbwood and Louise H. Westling. And it has close ties with post-structuralism and post-colonialism. Yeah, but, one might ask, how is over-intellectualising and complicating stuff going to do anything about the ecological crisis? Firstly, it helps to arm yourself with the facts in any situation. Literature gives us an amazing chance to see how our attitudes towards nature have changed over time. We can look at literature a little bit like a mirror in which our culture is reflected. Critics analyse the way the word is defined, portrayed, and even controlled by language. Critics analyse the way that the world is defined, betrayed, and even controlled by language. You know that thing you say to your depressed friend? Girl, you gotta change the story you tell yourself. Said friend would probably have a therapist to discuss her problems with and look at her past, and only then be able to change her opinion of herself. These shifts in thinking feed back into society, and ecocritical thinking can empower us to change the way we view the world and to act. Andrew McMurray and William Major stress in the Journal of Ecocriticism, we fear our work is puny and that we always knew it to be. We fear we have been careerists and frauds. Still, there is desperate optimism that we invoked from the outset. Ecocriticism, after all, begins close at hand, born out of a felt need to confront, however indirectly, the wreckage piling up around us. Actually, many eco-critics recognise the need for action. Let's ground ourselves for a minute in current affairs and consider these activists who take it to a literal level, reading a book on climate science to the police whilst they're glued to the road as part of the second global rebellion in London a few weeks ago. The book, by the way, is written by XR and called This Is Not a Drill. That brings us to another thing eco-critics do. Look at rhetorical moves used by environmentalists and ask what we can learn from them about our cultural attitudes towards nature. That's not saying everyone should sign up to groups like XR and take to the street. However, there is strong evidence that a critical mass of 3.5% of the population is needed to mobilise before the tables are turned. Just saying. The bottom line is that eco-critical thinkers encourage a healthy and informed scepticism of the status quo. There's even a whole emerging genre, aptly named cli-fi, which is defined as fictional books that bring real climate science to the reader in some way. Robert Macfarlane, a nature writer from the UK, argues that writers play a crucial role in helping us to imagine the impact of climate change. So do theorists and critics when they ask questions that feed back into our understanding of a relationship between nature and culture, human and non-human. To get a better sense of how Shepherd represents humans in relation to nature, I got a book on ecology at the library. Immediately, I noticed how both books are divided into chapters dealing with different species, environmental factors and relationships. In this way, Shepherd's writing is two things, both anecdotal field report and beautiful prose. Homo sapiens are even given a chapter of their own entitled Life, Man. This follows from the chapters Life, the Plant... This follows on from chapters Life, the Plants, and Life, Birds, Animals and Insects. It remains ambiguous whether humans are included as another biotic family that belongs in the hills or separated as an other. However, I'd be inclined to believe in the former. Shepherd gives equal respect and consideration to the abiotic elements. This is the inanimate world, the rocks and minerals and so on, recognising these elements to be the foundations of all life, literally. Speaking about hills, such allusions, depending on how the eye is placed and used, drive home the truth that our habitual vision of things is not necessarily right. It is only one of an infinite number, and to glimpse an unfamiliar one, even for a moment, unmakes us, but steadies us again. Shepherd talks about her continually changing perception of the landscape, how the colours change depending on the light, how the hills appear magnified in moist air, how summer on the plateau for her can be as delectable as honey or a roaring scourge. She describes walking through the cairngorms as a deeply personal and spiritual process where her self merges with her surroundings. In doing so, she reminds us that it's possible to break away from this construction that humans are separate from nature. There's a sense that this plateau of the cairngorms is a metaphor for a higher spiritual plane in which she finds herself able to connect deeper with the land and with herself. Another quote. Roads that were mended after the last spate are stripped of their bones, bridges are washed away. My path comes to a place where I had forgotten there was a bridge. It's a mere plank over a ditch. Before I reach the middle, I am afraid. I retreat. There is another way round. But next time, there may not be another way round. Here, Shepherd addresses the power hierarchy, likening her fear of the river to people of ancient times who worshipped natural forces and felt very much at the mercy of nature. Through her primal fear and description of the sheer devastation the flooding can have on man-made infrastructure, we get a sense that she's trying to remind us that although we can do our best to tame natural forces, the water does, quote, nothing, absolutely nothing, but be itself, end quote. It has no agenda. It's life-sustaining, yet the illusion that we have it under our control is just that, an illusion. It's hard to read this passage and not be reminded of the scores of natural disasters which grow in number each year, all caused by, you guessed it, man-made climate change. If that's the case, and we really can influence the weather, does that make us the new god? I'd be inclined to give a hard no and say that we are the most vulnerable now that we've ever been. Taken literally, the end of that extract describes her decision not to ford the stream and search for an alternative route, but read in today's context, I can't help being reminded of the urgency of the planet's situation in the phrase, quote, there might not be another way around, end quote. It speaks to me of the sinister possibility that it may already be too late to change the fact that billions of people, not to mention billions of animals and plants, are going to be wiped out in a wave of mass extinction, and that man-made solutions can only do so much. Shepherd describes the effects of the process of climbing higher into the mountains on her body and psyche as reverting to a more natural and wild state. The word she uses for this, fae, has connotations of otherworldliness, clairvoyance and bewitchment in Scotch and Irish. The word she uses for this, fae, has connotations of otherworldliness, clairvoyance and bewitchment in Scots and Irish, whereas if you look at the etymology in different areas, it means fated to die in Middle English, obsolete in Old English, and the Old Norse fager means doomed. It's hard not to be disturbed by that when thinking about today's climate crisis. Shepherd offers another definition, a little mad. I think it's important to see this return to the id as a way of communicating with nature in an untamed and unrestricted way which feeds the wildness of the spirit. Environmentalist George Monbiot is a big proponent of rewilding and says something in his book Feral that I thought fitted here quite well. He says, it's not enough to know what you're fighting against, you must also know what you're fighting for. To this end, Nan Shepherd's big love and respect for the cairngorms is so valuable because it reminds us of this profound effect natural places have on the spirit, freeing us from the trappings of the mind and the physical body. And I'll end on a quote. Nan Shepherd, it is therefore, when the body is keyed to its highest potential and controlled to profound harmony, It is therefore when the body is keyed to its highest potential and controlled to a profound harmony deepening into something that resembles a trance, that I discover most nearly what it is to be. I have walked out of the body and into the mountain. I am a manifestation of total life, as is the starry sacred suffrage or the white-winged ptarmigan. Thank you for listening.